July 16th, 1945. 5:29 a.m. Jornada del Muerto. Desert, New Mexico. The sky is still more night than morning. A dark violet bowl stretched over the jagged silhouettes of the Oscura Mountains. The air smells of dust and metal, of gasoline and sweat, out in the empty expanse. A steel tower rises 100 feet above the desert floor. A stark, angular skeleton holding a strange, compact object at its peak. The device has a name that sounds almost playful: Gadget. There's nothing playful about it. Inside the control bunker, code-named Jumbo, the walls hum softly with equipment. Oscilloscopes glow green, timers tick, relays click in dry mechanical rhythm. Men cluster around tables and consoles, their faces pale in the harsh electric light. Helmets, headphones, coffee cups, ashtrays filled with smoked-down cigarettes. At one end of the room, a tall, gaunt man in a rumpled jacket stares at a bank of instruments without really seeing them. J. Robert Oppenheimer, scientific director of the Manhattan Project, presses his thumb into his fist until the knuckle goes white. He notices, absently, that his hands are trembling. Two officers step aside to let another scientist pass. Edward Teller, stocky and intense, clutches a pair of welder's goggles, the glass so dark it seems almost opaque. He had argued for sunscreen, for protection. He had argued once about the sky itself. You could stand there with him, a few steps behind, and almost hear the echo of earlier arguments. The conference rooms in Los Alamos, where equations filled chalkboards from edge to edge, the nervous laughter when Teller first voiced the question that no one wanted to say out loud. What if the bomb ignites the atmosphere? It had begun as a theoretical curiosity. At least that is what they had told themselves. A chain reaction not just in the plutonium core, but in the nitrogen and oxygen of the air, in the hydrogen of the oceans. A runaway fusion fire that would race around the world in seconds and turn the surface of the earth into a thin shell of ash. The calculations had followed. Hans Bethe, calm and methodical, running cross-sections and probabilities. Others checking, rechecking. They had argued until long after midnight, ink staining their fingers, paper piling up on the table. Finally, the answer that everyone wanted. And no one fully trusted the probability was extremely small. Not zero, but close enough that generals could nod, and scientists could sign off, and construction crews could keep building the tower in the desert. Now, as the countdown approaches, that tiny number feels large in the silence. A voice crackles over the loudspeaker, flat and controlled. -5 minutes. Oppenheimer exhales slowly. Around him, men adjust their goggles and turn away from the slit windows. Some kneel beside the concrete wall, as if instinctively seeking cover from something no war could ever truly stop. Others, despite orders, steal one last look at the tower, in the distance a faint, spider-like shape against the horizon. You imagine what it would be like to be in his head at that moment, knowing the arguments, the reassurances, and the buried, unspoken fear that somewhere in those equations, in those margins and approximations, there might be a mistake outside. The first pale hint of dawn brushes the clouds. The world waits, unaware that a small group of men in a concrete bunker are about to test not only a weapon, but the very limits of their own certainty. -1 minute. Someone swallows hard. Someone laughs, too loudly, then falls quiet. And somewhere in the room, beneath the layers of calculation and courage, a single question flickers like static in the back of every mind. What if we were wrong? -30 seconds. The voice in the loudspeaker is steady, but there is a faint quiver underneath, like static. In the bunker, the air feels thicker now, as if the desert itself is holding its breath. Kenneth Bainbridge, the test director, leans over the console. Eyes on the master switch that will start the firing sequence. Thick cables run from this room out across the desert into relay stations and finally up the steel tower to the gadget. Somewhere out there, a web of wires and detonators, waits for a precise electrical pulse that will crush a plutonium core into the density of a star. Behind him, Enrico Fermi chats with a small knot of observers in a low, almost casual voice. Casual is an act. Fermi holds a small handful of paper scraps. "If the blast is very large," he says, "the shock wave will arrive here in just a few seconds. I plan to drop these when the light appears. We can estimate the yield by how far the air carries them." You picture it a Nobel Prize-winning physicist standing in a concrete bunker, about to weigh the power of a man-made sun with nothing but bits of paper and a good eye. It sounds absurd. It is also exactly the sort of thing Fermi would do. -20 seconds. Oppenheimer adjusts his goggles with fingers that do not quite want to obey. For a moment, the desert disappears, replaced by chalkboards and cramped offices back in 1942. Edward Teller standing at the front of a room in Chicago, tracing symbols in white dust. "There is a possibility," Teller had said, however remote, that the temperatures achieved might ignite a fusion reaction in the nitrogen of the atmosphere. A pause. The scratch of chalk had stopped. Men who could derive the life cycle of stars from first principles, suddenly very aware of their own lungs, their own thin envelope of air. They had written it all down: reaction paths, cross-sections, mean-free paths. They had cursed missing data and made approximations, then cursed the approximations. Hans Bethe. Calm. Analytical. Slicing through the problem line by line. Finally, the verdict: the conditions outside the bomb would not be sufficient. The atmosphere would not burn. The probability of destroying the world effectively zero. Effectively. Not absolutely. The phrase had worked its way into reports and briefings. General Leslie Groves, the military commander of the project, had listened, jaw set, eyes narrowed. In the end, he had nodded. The war in Europe was over, but Japan still fought on. Casualties mounted on Okinawa, on tiny islands whose names most Americans could not pronounce. A weapon that might end the war in a single stroke was worth an effectively zero risk. Oppenheimer had signed off too. So had Beth. So had Teller, though he still argued about many other things. -10 seconds. Back in the bunker, Teller slides his dark goggles into place. Others follow his example. Some lying flat on the floor, some turning their backs to the distant tower. Someone whispers a quick prayer. Someone else mutters the payout for the betting pool on the bomb's yield, a nervous attempt at humor. Numbers are written on a board: 0.3 kilotons, 1551045. No one has bet on ignition of atmosphere. Fermi glances at the slit window one last time and lifts his hand. Fingers pinched around the paper scraps. You can feel it. Even from here, the collision between two kinds of knowledge. The hard, calculated confidence that the math is solid and the universe is predictable. And the softer, more ancient knowledge in the gut that says you never really know until you try. 3. Bainbridge rests his hand on the switch. 2. The desert outside is suddenly very still. 1. In that fraction of a second, before any light or sound, before the circuits complete and the detonators fire, before plutonium becomes something like a small piece of the sun. Every doubt, every late-night calculation, every whispered question about the atmosphere hangs suspended over the Jornada del Muerto. And then the current flows. For a millionth of a second, nothing seems to happen. The circuits close. The blasting caps fire. The shaped charges begin to collapse the hollow plutonium core. Inside Gadget, metal flows like liquid under impossible pressure, converging inward at several kilometers per second. At precisely 5:29:45, the core reaches critical density. From the bunker, it arrives first as light. Even through the slit trench and the heavy-tinted goggles, the flash is blinding. It is a sudden, electric white that floods the world, wiping out shadows and details and turning every man in the room into a stark silhouette. You feel it on the skin of your face, on your hands, like someone opening a furnace door only inches away. Oppenheimer flinches, raising an arm even though his eyes are already shut. Behind his lids, the brightness is still there. A ghostly, pulsating afterimage. For an instant, his mind empties. No equations, no fears, no probabilities. Only light. Outside, the steel tower ceases to exist. The bomb annihilates its own scaffold so quickly that there is no time for it to fall. Sand fuses into glass under the sudden heat, a greenish blister radiating outward from ground zero. At the center, temperatures reach those inside the sun. At the edges, the desert floor blackens and smokes. Then the fireball appears. It swells upward and outward, a boiling sphere of orange-white plasma, fringed with purples and deep reds where the superheated air cools and recombines. It rises faster than anything that large has any right to move, trailing a pillar of dust and vapor behind it. The familiar shape of a stem and cap begins to form. Not yet a classic mushroom cloud, but something close enough that the men watching know they will never forget it. In the bunker, no one speaks. Fermi remembers his paper. He opens his hand, and the scraps drift downward as if underwater, then suddenly jerks sideways as the first hint of the shock wave presses in. He squints, judges the distance, the angle, the fall. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he is already multiplying, converting meters per second into kilotons of TNT. Oppenheimer finally lowers his arm. Through the narrow window, he sees the rising column of fire and dust, the edges of the world tinged in sickly yellow. A line from the Bhagavad Gita floats to the surface of his thoughts, unbidden, like something remembered from another lifetime. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. Later, he will say it out loud. Here, in the moment, it is private, half prayer, half confession. Seconds tick by. The light fades from unbearable to merely blinding. The fireball continues to rise, stretching taller, its edges curling and rolling as cooler air spills around it. The stem beneath it is thick now, a churning column of smoke and sand reaching from the ground to the young morning sky. Then the shockwave hits. It slams into the bunker with a deep, concussive roar that seems to come not just through the air, but through the ground itself. Dust shakes loose from the ceiling. Instruments rattle. Someone gasps as the pressure squeezes his chest. Others grin wildly, a release of tension that feels almost manic. The sound goes on and on, a rolling, echoing thunder that bounces off distant hills and returns in overlapping waves. Out on the desert floor, fences fall flat, cables whip, and the few animals within miles scatter in blind panic. Inside, Bainbridge exhales, a long, shaky breath he had not realized he was holding. Fermi murmurs a number under his breath, an estimate of the yield. Oppenheimer does not bother with numbers yet. He is watching the sky, watching the cloud climb, watching for something that does not happen. The air does not catch fire. No second, larger flash races along the horizon. No impossible curtain of flame sweeps outward beyond what their models predicted. The world trembles, but it does not burn. The atmosphere has not ignited. For the first time since the countdown began, the odds feel real again. Not just ink on paper. The effectively zero risk has stayed where it belongs, in the realm of things imagined, not experienced. But if the world has been spared, something else has changed forever in that instant over Jornada del Muerto. The men in the bunker can feel it like the fading sting of the blast on their faces. They have called down a sun, and it has answered. The thunder slowly unravels into a distant rumble. Dust hangs in the air of the bunker, catching the last stray flickers of light from the instruments. Somebody laughs in short, nervous bursts. Somebody else just sits down hard on a crate, knees too unsteady to trust. For the first time, people start to talk. Well, Enrico Fermi says quietly, eyes still on the window. I would say 10 kilotons, perhaps a little more. He shakes the remaining paper scraps from his hand. The improvised measuring tool spent. It is ridiculous and brilliant all at once. Others crowd near him, repeating the number. 10, maybe 15. It had been more powerful than many expected, less than some had feared. Behind them, an officer scribbles notes, hand shaking so badly that the pencil squeaks on the clipboard. Bainbridge walks the length of the room, checking that the recording devices are still running, that the film cameras in their protective housings have done their work. The practical tasks are a relief. Cables, switches, film reels, familiar things in the wake of something completely new. At the back, Teller slides his goggles up onto his forehead. The mask of colored glass leaves a pale outline around his eyes, the rest of his face dusted and shadowed. He stares at the rising cloud with a mixture of awe and something harder to name. Satisfaction, perhaps, or vindication. He remembers the late-night sessions in Los Alamos, when the question of atmospheric ignition refused to die. He had run his own calculations, gnawing at the problem like a bone. There had been a moment, alone at a desk under a buzzing ceiling light, when the numbers seemed to lean the wrong way, when the cross-sections and energies hinted, just faintly, that the nightmare might not be impossible after all. That moment had not made it into any official report. It had lived instead as a knot in his stomach, a flicker of doubt he did not entirely share. Beth had untied the knot with his usual calm patience. They sat together, heads bent over the same pages. Beth drawing careful lines through sloppy approximations, replacing them with more precise terms. The more accurate the numbers became, the smaller the risk shrank, narrowing from something you could feel to something you almost had to squint to see. Now, watching the cloud tower over the desert, Teller cannot help scanning the horizon for anything unexpected, any sign that the chain reaction has slipped its leash and gone hunting in the sky. All he sees is the normal wrongness of a nuclear explosion, the towering column of dust and fire that is already beginning to mushroom and spread. The world is still here, near the center of the bunker. Oppenheimer pulls off his goggles and wipes a hand over his face, smearing dust and sweat. His eyes are bright, almost feverish. For a long time he says nothing. Then, softly, he asks, "Is everyone all right?" Murmurs of assent, a few strained jokes. Someone says, "I think our eyebrows are gone." Bainbridge turns toward him. His voice, when it comes, is flat, edged with something like grim humor. "Now we are all sons of bitches," he says. The sentence lands in the room with its own kind of weight. No one quite knows how to answer it. It is not about the physics, or the war, or the ignition of the atmosphere. It is about the fact that they have just proven that such a thing is possible at all. The ignition problem had been the most extreme example, the nightmare edge of their uncertainty. They had stared into that abyss, thrown numbers at it, and convinced themselves it would not stare back. They had been right, but the fireball still climbs, and the pressure wave still rolls across the desert. And in a few hours the telegrams will begin to move, coded phrases about a successful test that will ripple outward to Washington, to London, to somewhere deep inside the Japanese war cabinet, without a word yet being spoken. In that bunker, surrounded by instruments and concrete, the scientists feel the boundaries of their world shift. The atmosphere has not burned. The earth has not ended. But something else has been set alight. Something that will not be so easy to calculate or contain. Hours later, as the cloud thins and the sun climbs higher, the bunker begins to empty. Trucks grind over the rough desert tracks, carrying officers, engineers, and finally the senior physicists back toward base. The adrenaline fades, leaving behind a peculiar hollowness. On the ride north, the open truck bed rattling beneath them, Oppenheimer and a few others sit on benches bolted to the metal. Warm wind whips at their clothes, dust stings their eyes. No one seems quite ready to break the spell of what they have just seen. At last, one of the younger physicists speaks. "Do you remember," he says, raising his voice over the engine, "when Teller first brought it up, the atmosphere thing?" A few heads turn. Teller, seated near the back, looks out at the horizon as if he has not heard. Oppenheimer has heard. He remembers it too clearly to answer immediately. The memory is sharp, lit by the same harsh ceiling light that had burned over so many wartime nights at Los Alamos. It had been 1942, the project still a gamble held together by secrecy and urgency. They had crowded into a room that smelled of chalk and pipe smoke. Chairs scraped close to the blackboard. Teller had been restless, pacing a little as he spoke. He loved big ideas, loved pushing problems out to their furthest edges. "What if," he asked, "the conditions inside a fission bomb were so extreme that they could trigger fusion not just in the bomb material, but in the air itself? Nitrogen nuclei slamming together, releasing more energy, lighting off their neighbors. A chain reaction, not in a hunk of metal, but in the sky." Some had laughed at first. It sounded like something out of bad science fiction. Then Teller wrote the first equations and the room grew quiet. They had pulled in more people. Emil Konopinski with his neat handwriting and careful integrals. Hans Bethe with his calm, dissecting mind. Oppenheimer watched the problem change as it passed from hand to hand. From speculation to structure, cross-sections for nitrogen fusion, probabilities of collisions, the rate at which an expanding fireball cools and thins. At one point, the numbers looked unfriendly. Teller stared at them, feeling a cold line slide down his spine. The risk was not large, not even likely, but it was no longer obviously impossible. Beth went back to the beginning. He questioned each approximation, each assumption about how hot the air would get, how dense, how long it would stay that way. Slowly, painstakingly, he tightened the estimates, narrowed the ranges. The catastrophe receded, step by step, into the territory of the vanishingly small. Finally, they wrote it up. A short report, dense with symbols, concluding that atmospheric ignition could not occur under any plausible conditions. The phrase, "not a real possibility," appeared, quiet and reassuring on the page. Copies were made, marked secret, locked in drawers. The knot in Teller's stomach loosened, but never completely went away. Now, in the back of the truck, the younger man presses on. "Did you ever really think it might happen?" he asks. Teller turns his head at last. His eyes are hard to read behind round glasses dusted with sand. "I thought we should be certain," he says. "As certain as we could be." Oppenheimer looks out at the desert, at the long, flat distances that hid cables and blast pits, and now a crater of green glass. "We were never certain," he says quietly. "We decided that we knew enough." The truck jolts over a rut. For a moment, everyone sways together. A cluster of tired men moving in the same direction, bound by the same decision. The wind roars in their ears. Above them, the sky is a clear, indifferent blue, utterly unmarked by the calculations that almost made it an enemy. That evening at the base, the desert heat slowly bleeds out of the ground. The sky turns from blue to violet to a deep, star-pricked black that looks almost innocent. The men of the Manhattan Project fan out through the low, barracks-style buildings, shedding helmets and goggles, finding coffee, writing quick notes before exhaustion pulls them under. In a small office, light spills from a single-shaded lamp onto a cluttered desk. Oppenheimer sits there alone for a moment, jacket off, tie loosened. On the blotter in front of him lie a few sheets of paper, dog-eared and faintly yellowed. Not equations this time, but memos, summaries, copies of the old calculations. He lifts one page, eyes skimming phrases he knows by heart. Extremely improbable. No self-sustaining chain reaction in the atmosphere is likely. The words are dense, clinical, almost painfully calm. They mask the nights of argument beneath them, the whispered what-ifs that had haunted quiet corners of Los Alamos. He remembers the day those notes were first handed up the chain, carried from lab to office to the war room of General Leslie Groves. Groves had listened, jaw clenched, as the physicists described the risk. He had tapped a thick finger on the table. "If you tell me it is 0, we proceed." Groves had said, "If you tell me it is not 0, but small enough that a reasonable man would ignore it in a war like this, we also proceed." There it was, naked. The choice. The scientists had not been ordered to ignore the risk. They had been asked to quantify it, to weigh it against burning cities and dead soldiers and a war that seemed to have no natural end. When the numbers came back as effectively 0, the burden shifted from the blackboard to the conscience. They knew that nothing in nature is truly absolute. Every measurement has error bars. Every model rests on assumptions that cannot be tested until after the fact. They had stared into that gap between certainty and reality and then, one by one, decided to step across. Why did they still push the button? Because the war loomed over everything, a constant, grinding pressure that made even the most exotic fears feel small beside the very real, very immediate slaughter in Europe and the Pacific. Because their calculations, refined and cross-checked by some of the sharpest minds on Earth, told them that the nightmare was not just unlikely, but vanishingly remote. Because they believed that if they did not solve this problem first, someone else eventually would, perhaps with fewer doubts and weaker restraints. Because they were human, and humans are capable of holding two truths at once that something might, in principle, go catastrophically wrong, and that they will proceed anyway, trusting their reason over their fear. Oppenheimer lays the memo back on the desk. The ink that once settled the argument now feels strangely fragile. He closes his eyes for a moment and sees again the white flash over Jornada del Muerto, the rising fireball, the cloud clawing its way into the sky. There had been a second, right after the light, when everyone in that bunker simply did not know, when the world held its breath, balanced on the edge of their confidence. That was the moment the earlier calculations had all been leading toward. The moment when theory finally had to answer to reality. The atmosphere had not ignited. The sky had stayed where it belonged. The universe had followed their equations, just as they had hoped, just as they had bet their lives and everyone else's lives upon. Outside, the desert night is quiet, but it is not the same desert as before. A patch of it now glows faintly with fused glass, still warm from a man-made sun. The men who built that sun will go on to argue, to testify, to regret, to defend. They will remember the flash and the roar, and the strange silence just before, when a handful of humans, armed with paper, pencils, and an urgent war, tested whether the world would end. They held their breath at Trinity, not because they thought the sky was likely to burn, but because they knew, more honestly than anyone before them, how narrow the path of certainty can be. And then, knowing that, they walked it anyway.